Hello, LinkedIn, and welcome to this week's LinkedIn live session with my brilliant guest, Kevin Campbell. Now, myself and Kevin recorded a podcast that was released, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago now at this stage. So it's a few weeks since it came out, but a really, really popular episode, really interesting, high energy, nerding out on all of the data stuff as I like to do. But a really, really interesting episode. And we are here today to talk about some of the key points from that episode. I am broadcasting live from Tenerife, so hence the slight suntan and the absolute heat here, but it's lovely. And last week I went live as well, and I think at that stage I was just recovering from COVID, so I'm more or less fully recovered now, so all going well. But welcome to Kevin. Kevin, do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, your journey, and people analytics, and then we can talk about some of the highlights from the episode and give people a flavor of what it was all about?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. So my background is as an organizational psychologist, so studying human psychology in the workplace. Prior to going back to graduate school for organizational psychology, I had the pleasure of serving as a headhunter and a corporate recruiter for a search engine firm in the Bay Area known as Google. Might have heard of them.
Yeah.
I was
98% of all searches or something. Would that be right?
Something like that. Yeah. Fun story. I know a few people that used to work at Alta Vista that were given offers back when Alta Vista was the main search engine, if you can remember.
Yeah, I do.
By saying that.
Yeah. I don't think Alta Vista. I don't remember it being that popular. I think it was maybe more popular in the States than it was in Ireland. We had, I'm trying to think, Yahoo and I can't even remember what there was before Google. It's really...
My personal favorite back in the day was Ask Jeeves.
I remember Ask Jeeves. Yes.
But yeah, they ended up turning down offers to work at Google. You can only imagine what decades later that looked like.
Yeah.
But, my time there was much later. They were considered the best place to work according to several workplace lists, and I think they're still high ranking according to most. But a couple of things came up in that experience for me. One was there were times when I fell in love with a candidate that the hiring committee didn't fall in love with them. So I wanted to figure out if there was a more scientific, more research-based, less biased way to make hiring decisions. Yeah. And here I was working for the best place to work according to so many different lists. But I still saw a high degree of variance in terms of how engaged people were in their work and how happy people were at work. So I wanted to understand, okay, if it's not ping pong tables and free food and massages and all the amazing perks and doing cool stuff that matters for lots of people, if that's not what makes people happy, what is it that makes people happy at work? And that's why I decided to study not only organizational psychology, but positive psychology. And then I had the pleasure of working with the Gallup organization and Deloitte Human Capital Consulting and another survey platform by the name of CultureAmp. And then I went independent for a while. And now I'm at Qualtrics, where I am working with some of the world's largest organizations on helping them identify the current state of their employee experience, where they would like to go, and identifying and closing those gaps in experiences quickly as possible. And then another fun thing that I'm able to do because it's Qualtrics is connect all of that data back to business outcomes, especially things related to the customer experience.
Yes, of course. Yes. Yeah. Do you want to tell people, because I know what Qualtrics is, I know what they do. I actually interviewed with them many years ago before I really knew what they were. And I think they didn't really get what I was about. I was coming from this market research background. And I think there was a huge disconnect in what the recruiter had put me forward for versus what they actually did. But that's a story for another day, I think. But would you want to tell people a little bit more about what Qualtrics does?
Absolutely. Interesting story. Our head of IT, I tried to recruit for Google about 10 years ago, and he's still there. So I'm glad he didn't take the bite because he's great at what he does. So Qualtrics really created the experience management space. So whether you're thinking about customers or employees or your brand as an organization or the experience of working with a product that an organization creates, there are objective operational metrics that go into that, right? So how many of your customers return? What's their share of wallet? From an employer or an employee point of view, it's how many people did you hire? How many people have you onboarded? What's the turnover rate? And those are all operational metrics. But the operational metrics only tell part of the story, because an experience is not just an objective listing of the things that actually happened. It's the subjective component of how did that happen relative to your expectations? How easy was it? How effective was it? How engaging was it? How much of that extra piece of yourself did you give to that experience? And how much more or less did that experience rise or fall relative to your expectations? And that's where Qualtrics comes in. And it's it used to be more surveys, and that's still a pretty big component of experience management, but it's also passive listening. So not necessarily soliciting people for feedback, but having a two-way conversation with your customers and employees and people that interact with your brand through just listening through the different channels and the Twitter sphere and the social media scape, as well as all the data that's just available to be able to get that insight into what people are thinking and feeling and experiencing beyond just the operational metrics. So that's what Qualtrics created, and that's what we do. Yeah.
I think when you brought up a really important point there, and that's the expectations and like what are people's expectations. And if I think about happiness at work in general and what people's expectations of work are, and I think for me, the expectations are changing slightly, where previously you think work is work and therefore it's supposed to be work and it's supposed to suck a little bit actually. But now I think people's mentality around work is changing, and they're realizing that they can actually have or work in a place where they feel happy, or work doing a job where they feel happy and fulfilled doing what it is that they're doing, and that they're able to work to their strengths. And any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, there's some interesting research from Amy Resniewski that shows that there are a couple of different ways that people conceptualize their work. You can either see your work as a job. So it's something that you do as sort of a necessity, you do for money. It's not a central part of your life, but it's something where it's very transactional, and you show up, you do your job, and you leave. You don't work to live. Actually, you don't live to work, you work to live, and it's sort of a necessary evil. Then there are people that have careers, and those are folks that are really tied into their profession as a sense of identity to some degree. They still see it mostly instrumental, but they really see it as more of an integrated component of their life and identity. And then there are those of us that have a calling, that really feel like our work is related to some higher purpose, and it's a core component of our identity. And I think I hear you saying, and I don't know if this is true, but I'd be willing to say that there are more people that are shifting from careers and jobs and into callings, or they would like to find that purpose in their work more so than they have in the past. And I think there's also some folks that are saying, hey, I'm not a career person, I just need a job. And so I think there's a lot of movement within those categories happening. I think as organizations, as leaders, as employers, it's important that your value proposition as an employer matches the type of career persona, whether it's the persona that's looking for a job, the persona that's looking for a career, the persona that's looking for a calling, and match up the bundle of experiences and benefits and things that go along with that to match up with that shift according to the kind of job, right? If you're trying to sell a job like it's a calling, there's going to be a mismatch. Or if you're trying to sell a career like a job, or vice versa, it's going to be a mismatch. And you're going to have a lot of unhappy folks.
Like, and I think the key in there is the mismatch, isn't it? Like, I think that's, the research that I did, and I used Qualtrics actually when I was doing my research. I used Qualtrics for the survey for my master's dissertation on fit and how this perception of how we fit in at work or how we belong at work. And one of those things that I looked at was the mismatching or the misfit within organizations based on values and needs. And needs, I suppose, is directly related to expectations that people have. So whether or not their needs are going to be met at work. So it's really interesting that use of that word mismatch, and just I think generally speaking captures it all. But I think from what I see, yes, I love the distinction of those three different elements. I do see more people perceiving work or looking for work as their sense of purpose, as their calling in life. And I don't, I had an interesting conversation. This was a few years ago, would have been pre-pandemic, so it could have been about 3 or 4 years ago now. And in it, we were talking about previously where people maybe were more religious or that they would be more involved in their communities, and now work has essentially replaced that. So they're seeing their work as more of a sense of community and more of it giving more of a sense of purpose to their lives because they're contributing in the workplace rather than in a religious context, let's say.
That's actually that coincides with some research from the Gallup organization. Jim Clifton, the former CEO, talked about one of the biggest sociological shifts they had ever seen in their world polling data, where there used to be a lot more homogeneity. There used to be a lot more heterogeneity in the data, where some people would say religion or family or living in a free society is in terms of like their ultimate aim or the central component of their life. And many fewer people having kids, many fewer people belonging to a religious institution or having a clear political identity, and work in many places or having a good job replaced in many ways that central place in people's lives. And it would be interesting to see how that's changed after the pandemic, because I think for some people that's still true. But if they're like, hey, if I'm gonna have this be the central part of my life, I want it to be meaningful. Or they've decided that maybe this isn't the central part of my life anymore, and it's become much more transactional. And I'm not here to make a value judgment on that either way.
No. But it's really interesting, like that, and that concept in itself, I think, is something we could probably talk about all day. Just the fact that maybe it's kind of brought into question whether or not work should be the central part of our lives anymore, because for a long time I certainly have felt that it is, it's kind of wrapped up in our identities almost, and now people are taking a step back, taking longer breaks from work, able to switch off for longer, working reduced hours, looking for something that has more meaning or purpose, or to your point, looking for something that's a bit more transactional, that they don't have to care too much about what they're doing.
Yeah, as a side hustle and previous to joining Qualtrics, I've worked as an executive coach, and a lot of that work was around career coaching, not so much resume writing and interview techniques. There are great people that do that work. I don't do that work, and I didn't do that work very much. Reluctantly, I did it at times. But with regard to helping people find that fit, and I think there is a lot of idiosyncrasy in the way people view work, right? It's like, no, I believe your identity is defined by what you do outside of work. I had one client tell me that, and I've had another one saying, no. I believe that if I'm not making a contribution toward humanity, that I'm leaving something on the table, and the best way for me to be able to do that is through my work, my family and community and all those things too. But given that this particular person was really brilliant, they felt that, really making a mark on humanity was going to be the way that they were going to fulfill that meaning and purpose. So it's just interesting to see that idiosyncrasy within people and how they relate in that way. It's interesting when you say should, that's something that always raises an eyebrow for me, or makes me think a little bit, because I
didn't even notice. I'll just say I didn't even notice myself saying that, because I'm very conscious about the words that I use, and I didn't realize I said should, and I'm very reluctant to use the word just and little and all of these things. So thank you for pointing that out.
But I think it's an interesting question, right? And one of the ways that I like to try and operationalize that in some way is to think about it rather than should. And again, I don't want to nitpick over words because we're just having a conversation, but it's also like under what conditions, right? So because then you can still say should, but it's more of an if-then thing, right? If you want this, then you should, right? So then it becomes a little bit less of an ought to and more of a, well, this is one of the better ways of being able to get to this outcome. Should you decide that this is the outcome that you want, right? So like, if you think that the only way you're gonna be able to make the mark on the world that you really want to make, if that's true, if you believe the only way that you're able to do that is through work, then maybe the calling is the right thing for you, right? If you think that no matter how hard you try, you're going to be, maybe slightly above average, but that the majority of your happiness is going to come from things outside of work, then maybe you should have that approach. So, but I love asking that question because that's the question that sciencey folks were not supposed to get into, should not get into, but I play in that space if we think about it in a particular way. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, no, I love that as a reframe. I think it's so interesting. And I listened to a podcast, and I'm sure it was with Adam Grant. I'm pretty sure that was with Adam Grant a few months ago when I was still back in Ireland. I remember I was listening to it, and his whole idea was, I think he was challenging this whole thing that we think if we want to have an impact on the world, it has to be something huge. And when we think of, I think the example he may have used was Save the Whales or something like that. So we think that it has to be this huge impact, when in fact, if you bring again, going back to expectations, if you bring your expectations back down and say, what if you could have an impact on one person and change their life? What if you could have an impact on your community? You don't have to have this huge impact. I think social media perpetuates this idea that, when I think of examples, I think of Mark Zuckerberg for, thinking, wow, the impact that he has had by creating Facebook. But we don't have to have that level of impact in order to impact on the world.
Well, hopefully this conversation and the podcast that we put together can make an impact on at least one person. So, my challenge to whoever might be listening or whoever might decide to listen to the podcast is, oftentimes it's not the dozen good ideas that you hear that make the difference, but the one good idea that you put into action and actually use it to improve things. So my challenge to everybody here is to find that one good thing and put it into action. And I thank you so much for the time to be able to chat here today and the time to do the podcast as well.
And thank you too, Kevin. And I realized we didn't even spend any time talking about what we spoke about on the podcast. However, if people want to listen to the full episode, there is a link below, and feel free to pop any questions that you have. I haven't seen any questions come through live, but do pop any questions if you're watching the replay, and either myself or Kevin would be happy to respond to those. And yeah, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for your time on the podcast. Really, really appreciate it. I'm sure we could have lots of conversations about all of these interesting topics. So
I look forward to more in the future.
Likewise. Thank you, Kevin. Bye.